He hadn't been back in 11 years. 11 years of silence, guilt, and money that couldn't buy him a single night of real sleep. But on a cold Tuesday morning in October, Richard Calloway, one of the most powerful men in the state of Tennessee, sat in the back of his black SUV, staring through the rain-streaked window at the iron gates of a mansion he hadn't stepped foot in since the day his world collapsed. The driver turned around and quietly asked, "Sir, are you sure?" Richard didn't answer. He just opened the door and stepped out into the rain. And as he walked toward those gates, his hands trembling, his chest tight, something impossible happened. A light came on in the upstairs window, the same window that had been dark for over a decade. And then, slowly, the front door opened. Richard Calloway froze on the gravel path, because standing in that doorway, pale, thin, but unmistakably alive, was the woman the entire world believed was dead. His wife, Margaret. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What you are about to hear is a story drawn from real events, the kind of story that doesn't make it onto the evening news, but gets whispered between people who can barely believe it themselves. The names have been changed to protect those involved. But the truth at the heart of this story, the love, the loss, the silence, and the shock of what was found behind that door, that part is as real as the ground beneath your feet. So stay with us, because this story is going to take you somewhere you did not expect to go. To understand what Richard felt standing on that gravel path, you have to go back, all the way back to 1998. Richard Calloway was not yet a billionaire then. He was a 29-year-old man from Knoxville, Tennessee, with calloused hands, a second-hand pickup truck, and a dream so big it embarrassed him to say out loud. He had started a small pharmaceutical distribution company out of a rented office space the size of a bathroom. He worked 16-hour days. He skipped meals. He borrowed money he wasn't sure he could pay back. And through all of it, through every rejection, every sleepless night, every moment he wanted to quit, there was Margaret. Margaret and Holloway. She was a schoolteacher. She drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic. She brought him sandwiches when he forgot to eat and made him laugh when the numbers didn't add up. She believed in him in that quiet, steady way that some people have. Not loudly, not with grand declarations, but with the kind of patience that says, "I'm not going anywhere." They married in the summer of 2001. A small ceremony. 30 people. Wildflowers on the tables. Margaret wore her mother's dress. Richard cried twice and pretended he hadn't. For years, things were beautiful. Not perfect, but beautiful. Richard's company grew. Slowly at first, then faster than either of them could keep up with. By 2006, Calloway Pharmaceutical Distribution was a name people in the industry recognized. By 2009, it had offices in 4 states. By 2011, Richard Calloway was worth more than $300 million. The mansion came in 2012, a 14,000-square-foot property on the outskirts of Nashville, with a circular driveway, a wine cellar, a library, and a pool that caught the light on summer evenings in a way that made you feel like you were living someone else's life. Margaret stood in the doorway when she first saw it and said, very quietly, "Richard, this isn't us." He laughed it off, but she wasn't joking. Can you imagine that moment? The woman who ate crackers with him in a rented apartment, who taped his business plans to the kitchen wall, who believed in him before there was anything to believe in, standing at the door of a mansion and feeling like a stranger. That should have been the moment Richard stopped and listened. But he didn't. And that silence between them, that small, ignored warning, was the beginning of everything that came after. The money changed things. That's not a comfortable thing to say, but it's an honest one. Richard became consumed. Not by greed, exactly, but by momentum, by the machine he had built, by board meetings and acquisitions, and the relentless pressure of being the man at the top. He started traveling more. Dallas on Monday, Chicago on Thursday, London the following week. He hired a personal assistant named Diane, who organized his entire life in a color-coded calendar. He moved in circles now where everyone wore tailored suits and spoke in acronyms and measured friendship in what you could do for them. Margaret didn't fit in those circles. She still taught second grade. She still drove an ordinary car, even though she didn't have to. She still showed up to parent-teacher nights and coached the school's after-school reading program on Tuesdays. She was the same woman she had always been. And somewhere in the noise of success, Richard had stopped seeing her. Think about that for a moment. How does a man stop seeing the one person who never stopped seeing him? By 2013, the arguments had started. Not screaming matches, nothing that dramatic. Just cold, quiet friction. Margaret would say she felt alone. Richard would say he was doing all of this for them. Margaret would say she didn't ask for a mansion, she asked for a husband. Richard would say she didn't understand the pressure. And then one of them would go to bed, and the other would sit in the library with a glass of scotch, staring at the dark garden through the tall windows. The cracks were spreading, and neither of them knew how to stop it. Do you know what that feels like? Have you ever been in a relationship where two people who love each other are standing on opposite sides of a wall that neither of them can figure out how to climb? That's where Richard and Margaret were. And the worst part, the thing that haunted Richard for the rest of his life, was that he knew it. He knew, and he still did nothing. In the spring of 2014, Margaret told Richard she needed some time alone. Not a separation. She was careful to say that. Just space. Time to breathe. Time to think. She said she wanted to visit her college friend, Claire, who lived in a small town in western North Carolina. A quiet place. Mountains. No cell service to speak of. Richard, in the middle of a merger that consumed every hour of every day, said fine. He kissed her on the forehead. He watched her pack a single bag. He told her he loved her. And he let her go. That was April 7th, 2014. He remembered the exact date because it was the last normal day of his life. 3 days later, the phone rang. It was the highway patrol. There had been an accident. A car matching the description of Margaret's Honda Civic had gone off a mountain road in Haywood County, North Carolina. The vehicle had plunged more than 200 feet into a ravine. The ravine was dense with trees. The drop was steep. There was no way, the officer said gently, that anyone could have survived a fall like that. Margaret's purse was found near the site. So was her phone. Shattered, but identifiable. They searched the ravine for 4 days. They never found a body. Richard sat in the library of his mansion, the same room where he'd drunk scotch alone on 100 lonely nights. And he could not breathe. He could not speak. He could not think. His assistant Diane handled the calls. His lawyer handled the legal process of having Margaret declared deceased. Richard just sat there. For weeks, he barely moved. The company ran without him. He didn't care. For the first time in his life, all the money, all the power, all the success, none of it meant anything. Because the one person it was supposed to be for was gone. And he hadn't told her enough times. He hadn't been present enough. He hadn't climbed over that wall. And now there was no time left to try. The grief did something to Richard Calloway that his success never had. It humbled him. Completely, and without mercy. He sold the Nashville mansion 8 months after Margaret was declared dead. He couldn't live in it. Every room held a version of her. The kitchen where she made coffee at 6 a.m. in her robe. The garden she wanted to plant herbs in but never got around to. The hallway where she once slow danced with him to a song playing from another room, laughing because neither of them could dance. He put the mansion on the market and moved into a modest apartment on the other side of the city. He kept working, because work was the only thing that kept him from falling apart completely. But something in him had fundamentally changed. He started donating. Quietly, without press releases. A literacy program here, a rural health clinic there. Things Margaret would have cared about. Things that felt like conversations he was still trying to have with her. He visited her memorial twice a year. He placed wildflowers on the plaque. Always wildflowers. Like the ones on their wedding tables. Years passed. The company grew larger. Richard grew quieter. He turned 50. Then 55. He never remarried. People in his circle assumed it was dedication to her memory. And it was. But it was also something else. Something he could not fully name. A feeling that sat in his chest like a stone. A feeling that he had not yet earned the right to move on. And then, in September of 2025, something happened that should have been impossible. A letter arrived at his office. Plain white envelope. No return address. His name written by hand in a script he recognized before he even fully processed what he was seeing. He stood at his desk for a full minute, not moving, not opening it, just holding it. Because the handwriting on that envelope belonged to Margaret, and Margaret had been dead for 11 years. His hands shook when he finally opened it. The letter inside was short, just a few sentences. Richard, I'm sorry it took me so long to reach out. I'm at the old house. I think we need to talk. I understand if you can't come, but I hope that you will. M. That was all. No explanation. No context. Just those few lines. Richard read it 4 times. He called no one. He told his assistant nothing. He simply got in the car, not his SUV with the driver, but his own personal car, a vehicle he barely used, and he drove. He drove 2.5 hours to the outskirts of Nashville, to the wrought iron gates of the mansion he had sold 11 years ago. The mansion had passed through 2 owners since then and sat vacant for the last 3 years after a legal dispute had frozen the sale. Richard had kept a key. He wasn't even sure why. Maybe because there were parts of that house he wasn't ready to let go of. Now, sitting in his car in the October rain, staring at those gates, he understood something in his gut that his mind was still refusing to accept. She was in there. She was actually in there. He got out of the car. He walked toward the gates. The iron was cold and wet under his hand. He pushed it open. The gravel crunched under his feet. And then, a light in the upstairs window. And then, the front door opened. And there she was. She looked older, of course. Her dark hair had threads of silver through it now. She was thinner than he remembered. There were lines around her eyes. But she stood straight. She held the door with one hand and looked at him from across the threshold with an expression he would spend years trying to describe. Not guilt exactly. Not fear. Something closer to exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying something enormous for a very long time. Richard stopped walking. He stood in the rain, maybe 20 feet from the door, and he said the only thing that would come out. "Margaret," she said, "come inside. You're getting soaked." And even in that moment, even in the middle of the most shocking moment of his life, her voice was still the same. That was somehow the thing that undid him the most. He went inside. The mansion was cold and mostly empty. A few pieces of furniture left behind by a previous owner, a lamp, dust on everything. They sat across from each other at a bare dining table in a dim room, and Margaret told him the truth. All of it. After she left in April of 2014, she had in fact driven toward Claire's place in North Carolina. But she had stopped first at an overlook on the mountain road to think. She was sitting on the hood of her car looking at the valley when a woman driving too fast around a curve lost control and struck her car from behind, sending the Honda Civic off the edge of the road and into the ravine below. Margaret had not been in the car when it went over. She had been standing outside it. She watched her own car disappear into the trees. And she stood there at the edge of that mountain road for a long time. Cars passed. No one stopped. And in that strange, silent, surreal moment, she made a decision that she had spent 11 years trying to justify and still wasn't sure she could. She decided to let it be. She let them believe she was gone. She called Claire from a payphone 2 days later and swore her to silence. She moved to a small town in eastern Tennessee under a different name. She got a job at a library. She lived quietly. She healed. She found, for the first time in years, a version of herself she recognized. The version that existed before the mansion, before the money, before she became a woman who felt invisible in her own life. She had not planned for it to be permanent. But weeks became months, and months became years, and every time she thought about calling Richard, something stopped her. Partly fear, partly shame, but partly, and this was the hardest part for her to say, partly because she had finally found peace, and she was terrified of losing it again. She told him all of this without flinching, and Richard sat across from her in the dim, cold room and listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He just listened. And here is the question that this story forces you to ask yourself, and I want you to sit with it for a moment. If you were Richard, hearing this, hearing that the woman you had grieved for 11 years had been alive all along, had chosen to let you believe she was dead, what would you feel? Rage? Relief? Something in between? And if you were Margaret, carrying the weight of that choice for 11 years, never fully at peace, finally sitting across from the man you once loved and telling him the truth, what would that feel like? What would it cost you? When Margaret finished speaking, the room was completely silent. The rain had stopped. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic somewhere on the highway. Richard sat perfectly still. Then, very slowly, he put his face in his hands. And he didn't speak for what felt like a very long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. And he said something she had not expected. He didn't ask why. He didn't accuse her. He said, "I'm sorry." Just that. 2 words. Margaret stared at him. And he continued. He told her he had spent 11 years understanding, piece by piece, everything she had needed that he had failed to give. He told her about the wildflowers at her memorial. He told her about the literacy programs and the rural clinics. He told her that every donation, every quiet act, had been a conversation he was trying to have with her through the only language he had left. He told her that the mansion, this very house, was the place he hated most in the world because it represented everything he had gotten wrong. And then he said, "I don't know if any of that matters. I don't know if I have the right to ask anything of you. But I needed you to know that I know. I finally know what I should have known a long time ago." Margaret looked at him across that bare table for a long time. The lamplight cast shadows across her face. And then she said something that neither of them had planned on. She said, "I kept the key too, Richard. To this house. I don't know why either. Think about what that means. Two people, 11 years apart. The same key to the same house. Neither one of them able to fully let go. There is something in that detail that reaches into the chest and holds on. Have you ever held on to something, an object, a memory, a feeling, long after the logical part of your brain told you to let it go? Have you ever kept something not because it made sense, but because some deep, quiet part of you wasn't finished yet? They did not fall back into each other's arms that night. Real life doesn't work like that. Real love, the complicated, weathered, honest kind, doesn't work like that either. What happened was far slower and far more real. Margaret and Richard talked for 6 hours that night in that cold, empty mansion. They talked about the years before the accident. They talked about the arguments and the silences and all the moments when one of them should have tried harder and didn't. They talked about the versions of themselves they had each become in the years apart. Margaret had discovered, in her small-town library life, that she was actually happy in ways she hadn't been in years. She loved the quiet. She loved knowing her neighbors by name. She loved being useful in small ways, recommending a book, helping a child find a story, organizing a community reading event. Richard had discovered, through grief, that success without presence is just a performance. That all the things he had built meant nothing without someone to come home to. Not someone to impress. Someone to actually come home to. By midnight, they were both tired in the way that only deep, honest conversation makes you tired, wrung out and somehow lighter at the same time. They agreed to nothing that night. No promises. No plans. Just the acknowledgement that the conversation wasn't finished. That there was more to be said. And that both of them, after 11 years, were finally ready to say it. In the months that followed, Richard and Margaret did something unusual. They met for coffee. Once a week, then twice. They walked. They talked. They argued about small things and let the arguments fade without declaring winners. Richard introduced her to his lawyer, not to get remarried, but to help Margaret reestablish her legal identity. A process, as it turned out, that is real and documented and far more complicated than most people realize. She had been declared dead. She had to prove she was alive. She had to account for 11 years. It took time. It took patience. But she did it. And through that process, through the paperwork and the waiting rooms and the legal complexity, Richard was there. Not leading. Not managing. Just there. The way she had once been there for him, in that rented office space, with sandwiches and belief. This was his turn, and he did not miss it. 1 year after Richard walked through those mansion gates in the October rain, he made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He announced the sale of the Nashville mansion, not to an individual buyer, but to a nonprofit organization that converted it into a community learning center. A library, a tutoring program, a reading room for children. He attended the opening ceremony and stood in the back of the crowd, not at the podium. And in the front row, watching as children ran their fingers along the spines of new books, sat Margaret. She turned once and caught his eye from across the room. She smiled. It was the same smile from the small wedding in 2001. The wildflowers on the table smile. And Richard understood something in that moment. Something he wished he had understood 30 years earlier, but was grateful, desperately grateful, to understand now. Some things that break can be rebuilt. Not into what they were before, never exactly that, but into something honest. Something chosen. Something that both people have to actively decide to build, with eyes open and hands steady. Now, I want to ask you something directly, because this story isn't just about Richard and Margaret. It's about all of us. It's about the people in our lives who are right there, present and real, and how easy it is to look past them when we're chasing something we've convinced ourselves is more important. How many of us have been Richard, so consumed by building something that we stopped tending to the thing that mattered most. And how many of us have been Margaret, feeling invisible in a life that looked beautiful from the outside, quietly wondering if anyone would even notice if we disappeared? The numbers, if we're honest with ourselves, might be higher than we're comfortable with. So let me ask you this. Is there someone in your life right now who needs more of your presence? Not your money, not your success, not your achievements, just you? Is there a conversation you've been putting off, a wall between you and someone you love that you've been walking past for months or years without trying to climb it? Because Richard and Margaret got a second chance that most people don't get. Most people don't get the door opening. Most people just get the silence. And the silence, as this story shows, doesn't stay quiet forever. It speaks. It just waits until you're ready to hear it. What happened to Richard and Margaret after that opening ceremony? They didn't rush. They didn't pretend the 11 years hadn't happened. Margaret kept her apartment in eastern Tennessee. Richard kept his place in Nashville. They called. They visited. They built something new, slowly, carefully, like two people who have both been burned and learned, the hard way, how to hold things gently. 2 years later, on a quiet afternoon in June, they sat together in the reading room of the community center, the room that used to be the library of the mansion, and they were surrounded by children choosing books. And Richard reached over and took Margaret's hand, and she let him. No grand ceremony, no announcement, just a hand, just that. And outside, through the tall windows, the summer light fell across the garden that Margaret had once said she wanted to plant herbs in, but never got around to. It was full of herbs now. Someone on the community center's volunteer staff had planted them the previous spring. Neither Richard nor Margaret had asked them to. It just happened, as if the house remembered. And that, right there, is where this story asks its final and most important question. Do you believe that the things we leave unfinished in life, the love we didn't show completely, the words we didn't say, the walls we didn't climb, do you believe those things ever truly go away? Or do they wait, quietly, patiently, like a light left on in a window, like a key kept in a drawer for no reason you can fully explain, like wildflowers placed twice a year at a memorial for a woman who, it turned out, was placing her own flowers somewhere too, at the memory of a life she had left behind, still not quite able to let it go completely. What would you have done in Richard's place when that door opened? And what would you have done in Margaret's? 11 years of silence, 11 years of choosing peace over truth, and then finally sitting down and telling a man who had failed you the full, honest, complicated story of why you disappeared. There are no easy answers here. This story doesn't offer them. What it offers is something rarer, a mirror. And sometimes a mirror is exactly what we need. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone, or made you think about a conversation you need to have, a person you need to call, or a wall you need to finally climb, drop a comment below. Tell us what part of this story hit you the hardest. Tell us what you would have done. Tell us where you're watching from. We read every single comment, and we are always moved by what you share. And if you're new here, and you stayed with us all the way to this moment, welcome. This is the kind of story we tell here. Human, real, emotional, the kind that stays with you. Click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because next time, we're going to take you somewhere just as powerful, a story about a man who lost everything in one afternoon and spent 20 years rebuilding it, only to discover the thing he lost had never been what he thought. You are not going to want to miss that one. Until then, hold the people close who are still there. Show up while you still can. And remember, some doors only open once. Make sure you walk through them.